Welcome, advocates, to another episode of the Leading Equity Podcast, a podcast that focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their schools. Today's special guest is Miss Jheri South. So without further ado, Jheri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I've been excited to have this conversation.
Pleasure's all mine. I'm also excited to talk about today's topic. It's a topic that I find very near to my heart, and anytime I have an opportunity to have these kind of discussions, I love to bring experts on into this space. But before we get into today's topic, I'd love for you to share a little bit about yourself and what you currently do.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for that question. So I am a behavioral coach. I've actually been coaching for quite some time, and within the last 5 years have really focused on neurodivergence. And one of the reasons for that is that I was diagnosed with ADHD later in life at 40 years old. And I have 7 neurodivergent children. So being able to help my children through the difficulties of their diagnoses, the things that we didn't understand, all the things that weren't working for them. And then it just kind of carried over into my work. I had not planned to be a neurodivergent coach. I was coaching teens, I was coaching parents. But as I learned, I started to understand how much misinformation was out there, how much we didn't understand. So I started interviewing the top specialists, taking camera crews to their houses, doctors who had retired, doctors that really knew what they were talking about when it came to ADHD or being on the spectrum. And I just took in everything that I can. And as I started to help my clients, I realized I had one client say to me, "This has been more helpful in 20 minutes than I've had with the last 9 doctors." And it's not because I'm amazing. I wish it was, but it's because we just aren't doing a good job out in the world and in the mental health field. We're not doing a good job helping people understand neurodivergence, what it is and what it isn't, and giving them the tools that they need to be able to not just function, but to thrive with their neurodivergence.
Thank you for sharing. And you got me thinking as I listened to you explain kind of your personal journey. You said that you were kind of diagnosed later in life. I'm curious, did you decide to get tested after your children, after you found out about the children, or was it before? Just kind of see where in that process it happened.
Well, it's a great question because today we see that's usually when parents find out that they have something like ADHD, their children are being evaluated and they're listening to these questions thinking, wait a second, I didn't know this was what ADHD looked like. What's interesting is that my sister actually had a binge eating disorder. And she was trying to figure out how to get proper treatment. And she stumbled upon understanding that it was associated with her ADHD, got a full diagnosis, and then everything else started to make sense. Where my children were struggling, realizing it ran in families, figuring out like which parent probably, also has ADHD. So it was everything just turned on at once. And I would like to say, oh, everything got easier once we found out, but that's not actually true either. Eventually it did, but comorbidity, for example, is so high when it comes to ADHD. So if you have ADHD, there's a 60% likelihood that you will have a comorbid condition and a 40% likelihood that you will have a second comorbid condition. So it helped in that we were able to start asking the right questions and getting some answers, but it also still took a while because it had been going on for so long with my children, for specifically not getting the right kinds of help, having people tell me that they were depressed, putting them on medication, doctors, therapists not understanding what they were going through, that we still had some work in front of us. But having answers, having awareness to what's in front of you is of course the first step. So yeah, but it was an interesting journey. It all kind of unfolded at one time.
Yeah, so it's interesting how you're saying like you notice stuff that your children are exhibiting. I was like, that sounds familiar. So I'm glad you took the steps to go forward and find out for yourself, because then you can figure out, oh, this is why I felt this way, or this is why sometimes these things happen. So it makes a lot of sense and it helps you out.
That's right. Absolutely. That's what happened.
Okay, well, let's do this because we've mentioned, if I had a counter, we've probably mentioned ADHD multiple times within the first 5 minutes of this conversation. And I want everyone to have the same understanding as far as what we're talking about when it comes to ADHD. So could you start us off by explaining ADHD and where it fits within the umbrella of neurodivergence?
You bet. So there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to ADHD. In fact, we'll still hear a lot of people use the term ADD, which is fine, but just so that everyone knows, that's really not a recognized medical term anymore. So the reason one might use ADD instead of ADHD is because they don't associate with being hyperactive. But actually, 2/3 of all ADHDers today are not hyperactive. So that H can stand for hyperactivity, but it can also stand for hyperarousal. So this is why we miss the mark so much. This is why people are not being diagnosed correctly. And the average age of diagnosis is now 31, because children, for example, who are willing to do twice as much work for half the reward, or are able to sit still in class and they don't seem hyper, they are being missed. We are looking for ADHD in behavior, and ADHD is not, it can be behavior, but it is actually, ADHD lives in here. It lives in the mind. So if you aren't hyperactive, you might be experience hyperarousal, meaning you have multiple thoughts at one time that you usually can't shut off. You may have trouble sleeping. You may overthink, create your own anxiety about being called on, or your short-term memory not really functioning the way that you would like, especially in a school setting. And so there's a lot of panic for getting things wrong. The average ADHD child by age 10 has heard over 20,000 corrective messages. So ADHD, almost every client I have, whether it's an adult or it's a child, is struggling with their own self-confidence because they don't understand, if they do have an ability like hyperfocus, they don't know how to turn it on. Sometimes it turns on, sometimes it doesn't, but they are very aware of their shortcomings. They're hearing things like, why can't you just sit still? Why can't you just finish? Why can't you focus? Why can't you try harder? They can do it. Why can't you do it? So ADHD is just as much emotional dysregulation as it is distractibility. And this is important because even in the DSM now, I think there's 18 behaviors that we focus on. It's all behavioral based. Again, ADHD, a couple of my children, they really don't struggle with that much at all. Straight A, honor roll student, but the emotional dysregulation is incredibly impairing. So I don't know if you want to get into rejection sensitivity dysphoria today on this podcast, but
Go for it.
okay, well, a lot of people have not heard the term RSD, or rejection sensitivity dysphoria, and this is associated with ADHD. So there's going to be a lot of people listening that really do think of ADHD as distractibility, inability to focus, procrastinating, what looks like being lazy, when in fact, ADHDers are intense feelers. So when we're up, but when we're down, and there's this influx of emotions constantly throughout the day, which can also lead to a lot of irritability, by the way, but it's that extreme sensitivity to rejection. So in other words, it's being teased, constructive criticism or feedback, the idea that you failed to meet your own expectations or someone else's expectations. So at least half the time, if not more, that rejection is perceived. But to the person experiencing it, it is very real. And it can feel so intense. It can feel like an internal wound. I would have explained it in my 20s, not knowing what it was, so feeling a little bit crazy, as being clawed from the inside out. So when we really understand what ADHD is, and we stop just looking for the boy who can't sit still and is pulling the girl's hair in front of him, then we can really start looking for impairments. And the reason we want to find them is because that's how we figure out how to help, especially in the school setting, how to help these children that don't always have words for what they're experiencing, or they're too embarrassed to talk about it because they're trying so hard to mask to fit in.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. Now, I know when I was younger, I used to hear the term ADD, attention deficit disorder, and then they added an H on it. And so then I heard there's no more ADD, there's just ADHD now. So you're saying that it can still be interchangeable at times based off of the H, the where the H stands? I want to make sure I'm clear.
Yeah, what I'm saying is we don't use the term ADD anymore. We always use ADHD, but that H may stand for hyperarousal. It may stand for hyperactivity.
Okay. And so typically if a child is diagnosed, it'll have that definition as far as which H it is?
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And people usually will know that about themselves. I'm hyper, I'm not hyper. And almost everyone with ADHD is probably experiencing hyperarousal to some degree. That some can sleep well, some cannot, but most ADHDers will say that their brain never turns off. The only time that I have seen that that's not true is if there's a comorbid condition. So take autism and ADHD, for example. A lot of the symptoms overlap, but some are very different. A lot of autistic clients that are on the spectrum will explain that sometimes they're not thinking anything, or they don't know what to say. Their brain is just silent. They're confused about how they feel or what they're thinking. Where just a typical ADHDer, for example, will have lots of thoughts and they're thinking all kinds of things and they have a lot to say. So when you have that overlap, it could look different for anybody who is experiencing both. Sometimes it looks a little bit more like autism. Sometimes it looks a little bit more like ADHD.
So are they, I know ADHD and autism are different, but are they often combined? Like, is it common for a child to have ADHD with autism?
It is, because the likelihood that you will have a comorbid condition when you have ADHD is 60%. There's a 60% likelihood. It is more common that you might see autism than it is uncommon. And that's something that most people don't know.
Okay. Well, let's talk about it. Most people don't know. My audiences we're educators, and so we're in the classroom, and more than likely, I don't know what the percentage is when it comes to how many students might have these attributes when they're coming into the classroom. However, I want to make sure that our educators are equipped to working with students. I know we have IEPs. I know we have 504 plans. Those are helpful. But as you mentioned, it's not always diagnosed. There are some things that we might miss, again, unintentionally. So what are some things that, I guess let's start with, what are some things that ADHD is not when we're looking in a classroom? And then maybe we can switch over to what it is and what are some things that we can do to support our young children.
Sure. So ADHD, now, of course, I recognize, for one thing, I just want to give a shout out to all the school teachers out there, because that is a difficult job. So I know that there's a lot that goes into that, but I'm not discrediting just sometimes teenagers and being hormonal, things like that. So I realize that sometimes a child might have ADHD and also just be going through a phase of life where they're defiant. But when we're just talking about ADHD is not wanting to be defiant. It's not disobedience. It's not being lazy. It's not having an unwillingness to do the work. And it's also not a lack of intelligence. There is this misconception that kids with ADHD just aren't quite there. They're not as smart maybe as a neurotypical child. So I want to give you a kind of a visual explanation of this. So this happens a lot, but I'm thinking of one particular girl. She struggles in math, and most ADHDers will struggle in math. And many times someone with ADHD, they can be sitting in the classroom and they're getting the information. So they're hearing, let's say they're in science class for a second, and they're sitting in there and they're listening to the names of the planets and how it works. They could memorize enough to take a test. They answer the questions correctly. But if you were to just sit and talk to them about how the solar system works, they wouldn't be able to tell you, because ADHDers struggle actually putting information together. Like, they struggle with the application. Okay. So this, if they're masking around their peers, they're not going to ask those questions. And so a teacher might be none the wiser to the fact that they're getting a B on their quiz and they're sitting still and they're listening for the most part, but they have really no idea how to put the pieces together and what they're learning. So that's one thing that's really important, because then that can change the way that we're teaching, the way that we're testing these children, the way that we're helping them with comprehension. The other thing is, let's go back to this girl in math class. So she's terrible at math. Her brain is not comprehending what she's learning, and she's struggling to do her homework every day. So she's getting an F in math. Then there's a quiz coming up, some kind of exam actually. And if she fails this, there's a good chance she's going to fail math for the entire semester. She knows this. So because urgency kicked in, and we can talk about the 5 things that turn the ADHD brain on, which is different than the neurotypical brain. One of them is urgency. And she does not want to fail math. She's able to study, get her brain engaged, She takes her math test and she passes her math test and she does a pretty good job. And then all of the adults in her life, her teachers, her parents say, see, you just weren't trying hard enough. You can do it. You just weren't trying. If you try and you study, you can do it. And a lot of times there's not this positive acknowledgement that she did a good job. In this girl's case, there wasn't. And with other children, there's this reprimand of, see how lazy you've been all quarter or semester when you can do it. But here's the problem is most adults don't understand their ADHD brains. And the teachers don't, so how are these kids going to understand that there is something that has to be ignited in the ADHD brain to get it to do the thing it has to do? So it could be in front of you. It could be important. There might even be a reward for doing it. And the neurotypical brain can just get engaged because it's important or there's a reward. That does absolutely nothing for an ADHD brain. And so urgency kicks in, and she doesn't know why that causes her brain to hyperfocus. And she doesn't know when she'll be able to turn that on again. And so this is where a lot of the lack of self-confidence comes from, is to be self-confident. You really have to show up pretty consistently in your life. If somebody asks you to do something, you can see it through, you can get your work done on time. And ADHDers do not trust themselves to do that. And so when she's asked why couldn't you do it? Why can you do this and you can't do your homework? And she says, I don't know. She doesn't know why her math homework has been hard and impossible, and she cannot get her brain to do it. And then for some reason, she was able to pull out a decent grade on her math exam. It is completely a mystery to her too.
Okay. So that's one strategy right there to me that makes, because I've done it, right? Oh, see, if you just try, I told you could do it. And it could be a lot more going on inside. And so how does the child feel in that instance, Jheri?
Terrible. So misunderstood because they don't know. Like if all of a sudden you were able to pull out this superpower and everyone was impressed with you, and then the next time the same opportunity came up, you couldn't get yourself to do it, and everyone's saying, we all know you can do it, just try harder. And you're thinking, I'm trying as hard as I can. I don't know. It leads to a lot of masking, a lot of self-confidence issues. So real quickly, let's address the 5 things that engage that cause the ADHD brain to get engaged. So we have an acronym for it. It's NICUP, NICUP. So novelty, interest, challenge or competition, urgency, and passion. So they don't all have to be present but at one time, but one of those 5 things has to be present. And I just want to put out there, I didn't make this up, right? This came straight from a doctor, a specialist who's been doing this for 30 plus years. But the idea is that we have to figure out a way to inject one of those things into whatever we're doing so the ADHD brain will get involved. There is not a lack of desire or even understanding, sometimes the comprehension and implementation, but for the most part, it's usually just this paralysis because ADHDers we need novelty. We need something that engages our brain with dopamine as well to do it. And so someone who's not ADHD, there are still a lot of people out there that deny that ADHD is real. Oh, everybody feels that way. You just force yourself. You just work harder. So unhelpful and absolutely not true. So we can't inject urgency. That's one of those things that just you can't force your brain to believe that something's urgent. But it's very common for ADHDers. It's the kids that at like 10 o'clock at night, they're cranking out their assignment. But here's the thing, when their hyperfocus turns on, it turns on. And so if ADHDers can get their brain into hyperfocus, we can work twice as fast as the average person, and we can really get it done. And most ADHD kids have an ADHD parent, whether diagnosed or not. So they're making cupcakes at 11 o'clock at night, the night before the big thing that they volunteered with the next day. Urgency is real for ADHD. Now, the others, the novelty, interest, challenge, and competition, huge. And passion, we're constantly looking at how we can inject these things into whatever's going on to keep that child engaged. So when I'm going into schools and I'm working with administrators and teachers on different ways to do this, one of the ideas that I'll give them is you could split the class into 2 teams. And because usually the ADHD is going to be interrupting, speaking out of turn, not paying attention. And the lesson in front of you, you can be having a competition, okay, if I can get through this lesson or for the next 5 minutes, but each team is earning points for sitting through the lesson for 5 minutes without any interruptions. But you can be doing it all day. So then that 5 minutes, this side of the room gets a point. And then, if it's older kids, it's like, okay, you just put a timer on and however long it is when the timer goes off, and we can start again. But kids will work for more recess time, quiet time. Sometimes it's reading time to chat with their friends 5 minutes before the bell's going to ring. So we're doing things to keep that ADHD brain engaged. And everybody loves games like that, because as soon as there's a challenge or competition, for the most part, that brain is engaged. And one other thing I'll point out is I've never met an ADHDer that doesn't rise to the occasion when they're put in a leadership position. They take an errand to the office. They are in charge of the whistle, the line leader. The feedback I'll get when I'm doing workshops at schools is, well, okay, PE, for example, I can't let them lead the class in stretching every single time that they have PE. Sure, you can't, but you're going to have to be creative about that. What else can they do? Can they be in charge of the balls? Sure, you might have to involve the rest of the class. I just know that you have two different kids, if they're in the background and bored, or they've been asked to be in charge of something, have a paper they need to cut, have a log that you want them to check off. When they feel important, all of a sudden they rise to the occasion. It's like you're dealing with a completely different child.
So do you recommend, because I've had conversations about rewards, and there's a lot of talk about why rewards are actually not good for students, because sometimes they just do stuff just for that reward and not necessarily learning a lot, or there's just different challenges that come with it. So going back to the idea of, giving a child, one of your most outgoing, if you will, let's just say that, colorful children, giving them jobs, such as the line leader or such as the stretcher and those kind of things. Do we recommend that in order for you to maintain this job or to keep this job, you must behave a certain way? And if you do, you'll be rewarded with the opportunity to do X. What are your thoughts there?
So it depends on what age we're talking about as well, because for example, if I'm working with a child in my coaching program, so my business is one-on-one coaching for the most part, I'll tell the parent they need a daily dopamine hit at the end of the day, and they need an end of the week. So that's really important, because if something's going to take too long, let's say we don't give them an end of the day dopamine hit, they don't get their points, they don't get their poker chip that represents money. It's like, okay, we'll address it at the end of the week. They will lose interest. So it depends on the age that we're talking about, because as soon as the child loses interest, it doesn't matter what you're throwing at them. And this is why we say neurotypical children will work if the task in front of them is important or there's a reward. That's usually useless for an ADHD child. The reward is not useless if it's something that's really important to them and they're going to get it in a considerable amount of time. So if they have to work all day to be a line leader, it depends on the child. And for some ages, that's probably going to be too long for how small that reward is. So what they're really looking for is the dopamine. ADHDers are compelled to do things because something ignites in their brain that's exciting and interesting and gives them some dopamine. So that you're going to have to make those decisions on a case-by-case basis per class, per age. But typically, I'm not against rewards for ADHDers. In fact, ADHDers will work a lot harder for rewards than they will for consequences. But the only way the reward works is if they're on board, it's something that meets one of those 5 criteria, and it's not going to take them too long to get it.
Okay. How about situations where we have students and, like you said, they're just disruptive, a teacher removes them from the class? I've always been one of those people that tries to keep students in class because they're going to lose instructional time if they leave. Do you have any strategies for teachers that you're having trouble keeping? You said it depends on age. So let's start with middle school, or let's do teens. So let's just say it's high school and we're having a student that's disruptive. What are some strategies? And I know it depends on the situation, but what are just some quick strategies maybe that teachers can do when we're thinking about teens in the classroom?
Well, let me just highlight one thing too. We were talking about rejection sensitivity dysphoria earlier. We don't want to call the child out in front of the class. So I could tell you lots of different stories about, so that is an RSD episode being triggered. I've had elementary school kids who have lost it on their teacher, said cuss words, all kinds of things. And they will say, if they would have pulled me aside and talked to me privately, I would have said sorry, but they intentionally, targeted me in front of the class. That's their experience, even though the teacher might think that's crazy. That's not what happened. So first of all, unless it's just tapping like, hey, do your work, or hey, make sure you focus. Anything other than that, like if we're addressing behavior and we want to talk to somebody about their poor behavior, we want to do that privately. And I have to say, I have tremendous respect for teachers. I know this is not every teacher, but there are a lot of stories. I go to IEP meetings. There are teachers who don't understand neurodivergence that do get fed up with behavior, making snarky comments in class, saying things out of turn is going to create a disaster. We do not want to power up with these children. They will dig in their heels, will trigger an RSD episode. It's just not wise. So I agree with you. I don't like to remove the child from the classroom unless absolutely necessary. And if we are going to remove them, if they can't behave, have them go talk to a counselor. Like, we want to have these strategies. So hopefully it's in the IEP. If it's not, we can come up with our own strategies, get to know these kids. What I can tell you is my experience is I have one child right now that's really struggling, and half of his teachers at the IEP meeting say, oh, he's great, he's awesome. They have like this personal relationship. And the others, worst child I've ever had. Like, he just doesn't listen to anything. He's disrespectful. And the difference is that they took the time to know him or not. So if you're going to make a difference for this child, or your class is going to be run better, my suggestion is get out of the mindset that we're going to show him and be really strict and power up, because that will probably go very bad. Try to get to know the student on a personal level, because 99% of these kids, it does not matter if he's a boy coming to school, acting tough, using foul language. Those same boys are coming in my office and crying, and they believe that nobody likes them. No one listens to them. They're always in trouble. So their behavior does not match what's going on the inside, and figuring out, what can I do? Ask him or her, what can I do to help? Have a private little meeting with them at some time, not that's going to embarrass them. Because for younger kids, there's a lot of things that we can do. I really believe in having personal progress reports where there's a reward at home, and every day the teacher is writing down whether or not they hit the mark. But one thing we want to point out is we want to give ADHDers some chances. It's not, oh, you didn't do it and you're out. When I'm working with my clients, teachers are sending home like long emails about everything the child did wrong, and we're not recognizing what they did. Right. And these kids respond to praise and leadership. So it doesn't matter if they've been horrible most of the day. If you catch them doing something better than they usually do, tell them, make a big deal about it, because that's where the behavior changes, is when they start to feel that somebody sees them for who they want to be. Many of these kids are so impulsive, they can't help it. And the idea that they can, and they're just being disrespectful and they're going to have to learn to help it, their behavior changes when they feel that they are liked, and they can tell who likes them and who just kind of wishes they weren't in their class. That's huge for ADHDers.
Got to give a little grace. How many times have we heard folks say, oh, well, when they get older, when they get a job, they're going to need to have these skills, and they're going to need, like, their boss is not going to, like, I hear a lot of that tough love type of conversations. And what I'm hearing from you is we do need to extend some grace.
A lot of it. These kids are crumbling inside. When I'm working with younger kids, they get 3 opportunities before they don't get the full points for their behavior that day. When it comes to teenagers, you have a choice. Of course, you're the teacher. You have a right to call them out and tell them what they're doing wrong. But you could also, figure out how to get to know that student a little personally at the end of the day, and see what happens when you do that. When you ask them questions about their life, or you give them compliment about anything that you can find that they're doing well. As soon as they see you as a friend, they want to please you. Usually, if we're just talking about ADHD, it makes it, and we don't know what their home life is, and we don't know how their parents are handling their neurodivergence. There's usually, my experience in working with these kids one-on-one is there's so much under the surface that you're not seeing. You're just seeing the impulsive behavior.
Yeah.
That they haven't learned to control. I just want to mention one more thing.
Right.
We know from Dr. Berkeley that these kids are 3 years behind in their executive function skills. So if you're dealing, with a 13-year-old, for example, you're dealing with someone who's really capable of executive function, their level is 10 years old. So keep that in mind as well. Like, what are our expectations for them, and are they realistic?
Okay. All right. I like that. And thank you for saying. I do want to briefly touch on for students that aren't diagnosed, or what are some of the symptoms that are out there, just so in case, teachers, we often are put in positions where we can refer students to get tested and see if there's something there. What are some symptoms that we should be looking out for, or we should notice for our students?
Well, of course, anything that looks like extreme hyperactivity, I think, is
Mhm.
a given. But also, a lot of times there's anxiety that goes into neurodivergence because things haven't been going the way that they want them to go. So if you see a child that seems to really get stressed out about things that maybe you think would be rather simple, like something you've been working on for the last half an hour, and they're stuttering over giving a simple answer, there's probably some masking going on there. And again, these are just things that we're looking for. This doesn't immediately mean that there's neurodivergence, but most neurodivergent kids will say that it's hard for them to even focus in class when they have a teacher that randomly calls on people. I am not a fan of that at all. And I was one of those people. I was one of those people that couldn't remember my name if I was called on in front of my peers. I was, because there's such there's a crippling self-confidence there. And so they're so worried about saying something wrong. They're already doing that in their social situations. At lunch, they're telling a story at the wrong time, or they're cracking up about something and no one else laughs. So they're so self-conscious. The other thing is, if you see that a child is really struggling in a subject in school, of course, we want to look into that and see why that is. Is it their learning environment? Is it a lot of kids who are neurodivergent struggle with executive functioning? So this means that they're just having a hard time keeping track of their different subjects. They're forgetting to bring their homework back to school. They're forgetting to turn it in. They're forgetting things in the class. There's actually something going on there. It's not like, oh, I just forgot and I'm lazy and I don't care. So really paying attention to how are they functioning in the classroom, and if their grades are suffering, especially if they're in math and they're struggling in math. I'm always like paying attention when someone is doing okay in their other classes, at least, and then they really struggle with math.
Okay. Thank you. Those are some very helpful tips. And definitely we don't want to stereotype our kids, and we
Of
just want
course
to pay
not.
attention. Yeah. Thank you for
Mhm.
that. Jerry, I'll say this, within this time frame, I have learned a lot. I'd love for you to share any final words of advice to our listeners out there.
Well, I think it's important to address that over the years, I've heard things like, how come we have to label everything? Why can't it just be they struggle with this thing and they struggle with that thing? How come everything has to have a label? And so my response to that is, I'm not big on labels when it comes to, I definitely do not appreciate my own children or any of my clients using a label as a crutch. So if I hear someone say something like, well, I'm just not good at that because of my ADHD, then we have some work to do there. But one thing that label does do is it helps us understand. It puts a name to something that maybe we don't understand so that we know where to look. I will also share that I have children in my office who have been cutting in elementary school, fifth and sixth grade, because they know something's wrong with them. I wouldn't define it that way. I don't think anything's wrong with them, but in their mind, something's wrong. I'm not like everybody else, and they can't figure out what it is. And when they find out that they're on the spectrum or they have ADHD, there's a huge relief that comes to them to learn, I'm not broken. There's nothing wrong with me. My brain just works differently. And I will say, as much as I appreciate the work that we're doing in schools, schools were not set up for the neurodivergent brain. Someone who's on autism really struggles with transitions. If there was I was talking to an influencer in the UK who was an adult, and he said, if I was able to build a school, if any person with autism were to put together a school, all day Monday would be math day. All day Tuesday would be English day. We struggle switching. It is not, and he demonstrated this for me, why it can be so challenging to move from one thing to the other. And for ADHDers would benefit from being able to interrupt, always work in partners and groups and talk a lot and touch everything. There's a pretty visual for every lesson that they're having, and there's a story every time we're talking about English or history to make it come alive. So we're not doing a very good job in the schools accommodating the neurodivergent brain as a whole. And so these kids are brilliant. They're creative when they can do things quickly. They're risk takers. They make fantastic entrepreneurs. They think outside of the box, and they really can see solutions to problems and pattern recognition faster than the average person. But the way that we are testing them and teaching them with just tests, they're usually terrible test takers. They're working memory. They know things, but on the spot, they have a hard time accessing it. It's really not the best learning environment for them. And so I think overall neurodivergent individuals are struggling in the traditional school system.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jheri. And I'm sure you have a lot that folks can learn from. Share with us what's available on your end if folks want to learn a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Well, so first of all, I do offer an ADHD quiz. I can't diagnose you in that quiz, but because the questions come straight from doctors and specialists who do those evaluations properly, it will give you a very good indication on whether or not you have ADHD. I also offer a free webinar for rejection sensitivity, dysphoria, and emotional regulation. And right now, my course, my ADHD course, which includes the module that I teach for 2 hours when I go into the schools on how to work with children, different ways that we can manage our classrooms. It has the mind management course in there and everything from estrogen to medication to interviews with specialists and doctors. It's $97 on my website. So, and then I have a lot of other freebies. So if you go to my website, jherisouth.com, there's a lot of information there that you can digest and implement right away that I hope that your audience would find useful.
Absolutely. Well, Jheri, it has truly been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation.